So, a little bit of a different circumstance than we were in last week. I'm not really quite sure what to say at this time. I'm assuming most of the people who are here are still in New York. It's been a challenging past handful of days for me. I live at 15th and 6th in the city, so I'm just a couple blocks from Union Square. I'm not really quite sure where things are going from here. Not politically, I have no idea about that, but just class-wise, we'll obviously keep doing this class. Yeah, this wasn't exactly a set of circumstances that I was planning for, and I'm guessing most of you weren't as well. So as we go forward, just bear with me a little bit, and I'll be cutting you guys slack as well anytime we've got assignments or anything like that coming up. Just make sure you've got ample opportunity. If people need to take care of other things, if you have problems, you just message me. We'll work things out. This is a unique circumstance. Yeah, so let's just try to be compassionate with each other through this.
Hey, Peter. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Kavita.
Hey, I just wanted to acknowledge you for doing just that, for creating a little bit of space instead of just jumping into the material, which has been my experience pretty much every class this week. And it kind of reminded me of when I was first week at Wesleyan and 9/11 happened, and we went to class and was just like, okay, let's keep talking about this random anthropology class. And it's really refreshing just to see that you're human and you're being affected, and you're also going to hold space for all the rest of us who are feeling very human and vulnerable and charged and everything in between. So thank you so much, because it is really hard to show up. I gotta be honest, every class I'm just like, this is bullshit, I don't want to be here. So I'm gonna just stay in there, and because I think that was a big move on your behalf, so thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, and frankly, I respect that. I mean, I appreciate the people who are here. I totally understand the people who aren't here. This is, I think this class is really important. I think this is a big priority for me under normal circumstances, because the cause that I care about the most in the US from a professional perspective is getting people out of pain so we get people less addicted to drugs. That's the thing that that's my personal central issue. I care about 100 other things, but that's the thing for me that's right at the core. So I care about this class because I see this as a way to help teach other people how to do that so that we get less people who are living in hell while they're alive. And that's really important to me. But I understand right now, there's other priorities that are coming into play. And, whether people are near to problems or physically or just emotionally, I'm sorry. And it's a messed up time. So hopefully all of you stay safe. Hopefully all of you are able to take care of yourselves. Hopefully the people you care about stay safe. And yeah, I'll do what I can to hold some space, but I'm certainly not at my best either. Yeah. So as we go forward, I'm going to try to slow this down a little bit and just go a little bit lighter this week. I'm in the doctoral program right now, so I was taking a class last night with helicopters overhead, and I noticed that when things got denser, I didn't pay as much attention. So we're going to try to lighten things up a little bit. I'm getting asked if my practice is open. I've ended up being very lucky and unlucky at the same time. I moved back to New York in September. I was working and teaching in Canada last year. And I was all set to sign a lease on a practice in December. And then I fractured my leg in 3 places. And so I didn't sign that lease. And that's ended up probably being a good move. So I'm looking for practice space right now. And hopefully within the next 3 weeks to a month, I'll have something set up. But yeah, I would love to be. I think this is not to sound morbid, but this is a time of opportunity for our profession because we can help some people with the things that they're experiencing. There's a version of Chinese medicine. There's a way of thinking about Chinese medicine that I don't really like, which is all about making sure that everyone's calm and peaceful. And for me, in this circumstance, I see one of the things that we're able to do to help people to channel their energy with intention. There's a lot of people who are I consider myself pretty fortunate. My housing is secure. I had some savings coming into this. You know, it's been rough on me, but there are a lot of people in a worse situation. So the more we can get out there and do what we can as a profession to help people, the better. And I think you guys training for this is helping to create a world in the future where there are more people able to help out. Okay, so if anyone has questions, wants to chat, anything like that, I'll do my best to be around. You can private message me on the Slack. I've had long conversations with a few people there. It works well as a medium. But yeah, just this class is important, but bigger priorities. Do what you can. Okay, anything else before we dive in? I appreciate all of you appreciating me. It's nice. It's, you know, it's hard to step into the class and teach at a time when there's so many things pulling energy in different directions. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate your appreciation. And we'll start moving forward if there's nothing else right now. Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to be starting off with the slides from last week that we didn't get to, but I kind of want to just pull back a little bit and talk, which means don't share that, and talk about why we're covering some of this stuff at all. I feel like slowing down and giving some context would be a nice way to start this class. So what we were covering last week, and what I want to continue and definitely finish this week, and then we'll get into more stuff depending on our speed, are the three biggest types of disease. And I want to talk about why we care about this and why it matters. You know, within Western medicine, you learn like different body systems. Like you've got the integumentary system, you've got the renal system, you've got the nervous system, circulatory system. We can map out the body using those things. In Chinese medicine, we start with external disease, internal disease, and miscellaneous disease. So last week we did like first pass on external disease. We're going to get to a second and third pass on that as the semester continues, right? This is us talking about wind cold and wind heat and dryness, invading, all those sorts of things. So we did the first pass on this. We're kind of like partway through the internal disease first pass because we spent a bit of time talking about emotions, right? These are the things that people generate on their own. This is all the stuff that you, in theory, could get in a hermetically sealed area, right? No bacteria, no viruses, completely pure in whatever weird way you want to define that. But we could still get these things. So this would be, if we want to talk about this like it's Western medicine, we could say that things like depression might be here. You know, there's lots of ways you can get depression within a Western medical context, but a lot of psychological things where we think of the environmental mattering less go here. And in Chinese medicine, this is, you know, liver over controlling spleen or heart qi deficiency. Then we got the miscellaneous diseases. We haven't really started on this. These are basically accidents or errors. And we'll touch on this a little bit, but you're not really going to learn much about this in acupuncture school unless you take some trauma medicine classes. But the extreme sides of this are usually emergency referral. As you're learning herbology, you're going to cover a bunch of herbs that do things like treat insect bites, or yeah, any sort of animal bite. You've got herbs for like fish bones stuck in the throat, which, you know, back in the day was a real problem. These sorts of things where it's like, we couldn't have built you up beforehand. It's not because you went out on a day when you shouldn't have without wearing the right protective clothing. This stuff just happens. So we're gonna, over this week and maybe a bit of next week, we're just gonna kind of fill in these a little bit more so that you got a better feel for all this. This making sense to people? Getting a little bit more context for this? Good, I'm seeing a couple nods. Yep, so today it's going to be, we're going to spend most of this first part on internal and miscellaneous diseases. This will be our first pass and our only pass really on miscellaneous disease in this class. And then we're going to go further into like, how do these happen in the first place? You know, we've talked about like, oh, you can get a wind cold from outside. One of the things that I like about Chinese medicine is if you line up 100 people and expose them to the same outside factors, some get sick, some don't, we can predict fairly well in advance, just based on pulse, tongue, and questioning, which ones will get sick and how they will get sick. So we're going to start talking about that. This is the sort of idea that within Western medicine, in theory, you can predict this stuff decently well, but in practice, you can't. And we can predict it quite well in practice. Okay. Just answer, I've gotten some private messages here, so just give me 1 minute to answer these. Yes, Yasuko, I will answer that in just a minute. So Yasuko is asking, emotions or movement of qi observed by the pericardium. Can you explain that? Yeah, so we talked a bit about that last week, but that could use one more pass here. So in general, so the idea here is that everything, I can spell, is movements of qi. Is movement of qi. That's it. That's the end of the sentence. That's the whole story, everything. Other things can be involved, but this is happening. What usually, and frankly, the hard part of this is really opening up to the idea of everything being a movement of qi. The protests are a movement of qi. Everything I'm saying is a movement of qi. Getting to the point where you can start thinking like this it takes a while. When we're talking about emotions, the question is, how do we think about emotions? How emotions do. So when we look at Matsuocha, he says, step 1 is emotions. Step 2 is emotions move qi. Step 3 is qi movement creates symptoms or diagnoses. We haven't really gone enough into diagnoses for me to be able to give you a lot of easy examples of this. So let's just work with, I'm just going to keep working with the same diagnosis: liver, yang, rising. Really recommend you learn shorthand. Saves a lot of time. Liver, yang, rising. Okay. When this happens, oversimplification, qi moves up pathologically. So we want qi to move upwards. The spleen is largely in charge of qi moving upwards. We'll talk about that later this semester. We need qi to move up, we need qi to move down. So the key here is that it's doing it in a way we don't want. Qi movement leads to symptoms. I want to keep all of this on here, but my whiteboard's small. Okay, so this is the Matsuocha view. I would put forward that qi moves is step 1. If pericardium is involved, some people will say heart here. Don't worry too much about the specifics. And this is not on your board exams or your comprehensive exams because they're outdated. So instead of emotion happens being the first thing here is that qi moves. If the pericardium experiences that movement of qi, we have an emotion. I'm going to use the example of liver yang. I'll leave that up for 1 second. Using the example of liver yang rising, 2 of the different symptoms for liver yang rising are red face, irritability. Your patient can, and then like 60 other things. Your patient doesn't have to have both. So we can put and, or, red face and or irritability as symptoms. But both of these are pathological rising of qi. The question is, what makes this and this different? The patient's qi is rising pathologically. One person gets a red face, one person becomes irritable, one person becomes irritable with a red face. What's the difference? The question is, the answer to that is, where is the qi rising and what does it interact with as it rises? And if it's interacting with the pericardium, or maybe the heart, depending on who you're talking to, then we're going to be more likely to get the irritability. And if it's rising in the liver channel, for example, or the liver divergent or Luo, we're going to get more likely a red face or a headache. Often it'll do both. Don't worry too much about the specifics of this. I just want to explain that when we see red face and we see irritability, the fact that one of them is a mental, emotional experience and one is a physical experience, we don't care. They're the same thing. It's just a question of what's getting touched on the way. Emotions aren't special. They're not different. They're just movements of qi, which means we can treat them as easily as anything else. You guys good with this? Can I erase it? Okay. That answer your question? This is worth going over a few times over the course of the semester because it's a big idea. With again, just within the Western medical concept, we have emotions, and they're kind of in this black box where we can't see in. We don't have a theory. We don't know how they work. So stimulus leads to emotions, or leads to something, leads to emotions, is basically the Western medical model, and we don't know what's in this box. Within Chinese medicine, qi moves, PC, heart involved, keeping it very simple at this stage, emotion. We can fill in that box in the middle. So this is why a lot of the treatments that we have for emotional disturbances involve the point pericardium 6, for example. Why are we treating anger with the pericardium, but also depression, but also sadness, but also insomnia, but also anxiety? It's because we're treating this section of it. We're going to talk about this sort of idea a little bit more later today when we review how postnatal qi is made. The basic idea being, if you've got the lungs and the spleen involved, and it has to go through the heart to make qi, and the kidney has to participate, I can spell. If all of that's true, the person might be eating correctly and breathing correctly, but they might have a kidney problem, and then their qi production is low, and then they look at their diet and their breathing, but they don't examine the root. We can look at that, because the problem can come anywhere in the flow. We're going to go over that later today. Jasmine, what's your question?
Just curious to why it's specifically PC6 and not any other PC.
It's a Luo point. I use other PC points. PC4 and PC6 are my 2 favorite. PC6 is everybody's favorite. It's a great point. everybody's correct. PC4 is often overlooked. This one has a Luo function. This one I like because it cools the blood. And has some, it does a lot of stuff. But this is because it's a Luo. You guys know what Luos do, right? Someone want to tell me what a Luo does?
Well, I
The
remember
branches of the main channels.
Yep, it's a branch off the main channel. What do we care about it?
It's supporting the para organ.
Yes, it helps connect it to the para organ. And when we use Luo points on yin channels, I'm not sure if you guys have learned this yet. What point do we pair that with on yang channels?
I think the source.
Right. And why do we do that?
This I don't remember.
Anybody? Anybody?
Host guest
That's what it's called, but why do we do it?
to
Why do we do
strengthen, because that's where, so it's like that's where the original chi, that's where the source of life or chi or whatever you want to call it is. So when you're dealing with Luo, you want to support that so it's not over taxing.
You got a bunch of pieces there. So the source points, the UN source points, are going to pull qi to the channel through the sanjiao from the kidneys. So this is going to tonify to remove excess. So similar to front mu points, which can be used to remove excess from an organ, we use the Luo points to remove excess. This isn't the only thing they do. We use Luo points combined with source points to remove excess, especially from the channels. The most common version of that is lung 7, Li4. Li4 is often thought of as being overused. Well, it does a very different thing when you pair it with lung 7 than we're actually using it to treat the lung. So if you want to treat grief, that's an easy starting combo, for example. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So the example you just gave is a yang channel yuan point plus a yin channel luo point. Can we have the opposite with a yuan point from the yin channel plus a luo point from a yang channel?
Yes, but not really. So the yin organs are supposed to be solid. I'm sure you guys have heard this before. We're going to talk about it later in the semester. We're really just getting ahead of ourselves right now a little bit, but I'm all right to meander a little right now. And so the solid organs have one entrance and one exit. It's shared. And then the fu organs have a separate entrance and exit. So like the large intestine, it's supposed to go in one direction, whereas say the lungs, in and out the same way. Fu, yang, organ. There's consistency here. Hollow organ, right? So the reason, so if we're going to use Luo, get stuff out. It's harder to do in these. We often want to get things out of yin organs. Things get trapped in these easily. Source, get stuff out. I'm being very exact with the word stuff here. That's because if a yang organ is healthy and is functioning properly, one of the things it will do is move things along. A healthy, happy, functioning large intestine, its main job is to get things out of the body. And if we want to get things out of the yin organs, that's not their natural job. They're not great at that. They usually need help. So if we have, let's say, qi stagnation in the lungs, we can try to get it out through moving the qi in the lungs, but we don't really have a lot of points for that. Like the He point, for example, will return the qi to the lungs. It'll stop coughing. It'll help regulate this. But if we want to get things out, just clear them, the easiest way is to use the Luo point to have the large intestine, the paired yang, do the work. So we can reverse this, but they don't really work together the same way, because if we want to remove excess from a yang organ, first off, we don't use the yang luos nearly as much as the yin luos, and you don't see this combo very often, in my experience. There might be some people who use it more that I'm not aware of. But if you want this to work better, you're usually just going to use the source point anyways, and you don't need the assistance of the yin organ to do it. That make sense? Great.
Yes.
Cool.
So,
Slacken.
sorry, just wanted to make sure I get it. So the yin one is, the yin luos need more support, especially because they only have one area where things go in and out, I guess. Versus the yang channels, they have two different points. So just supporting them through the source is enough to kind of encourage it.
Yep. So like for myself, let's say we've got qi stagnation in the large intestine. I'm going to be much more likely to use Li4, which will begin moving this out, paired with something like abdominal massage. With maybe abdominal points as well. I don't really have to use the lung. I might, but it's not mandatory here. Whereas if I want to get excess out of the lungs, it's not mandatory, but it's very helpful to use the large intestine. Okay. Slackening qi in joy is heart qi. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Yasuko. Yes, well, so usually joy is said to slow the qi. This to me sounds like a happily meandering river. I think when it says slow, it's hard for us to think about why that's bad, especially because cold will also slow things down. So it's like, well, how are cold and joy different? Well, the way that joy does this is more like, if you think of, you guys can look this up later. If you look at a tensegrity model, which is a model where you have like something that's held up because you've got different, this went somewhat viral a little while ago. You get things like these chairs with a rigid piece and a rigid piece, and then they're held together just by a string here. And in theory, all of this should tip over, but you also have strings tensioning the table down or the chair down in all these different directions. So the chair can't tilt, which means that this little string actually keeps this all balanced. In the body, we're doing that with antagonistic muscles all the time, right? So like if someone has back pain, sometimes you have to strengthen their core because the front muscles and the back muscles support each other. When the qi is slackened, it's like, oh, it's good to relax, but like, how much is it good to relax? Because if you relax too much in one direction, then things are going to fall that way. So excessive slackening of the qi due to joy tends to get people very unformed and blob-like in a way that I associate with slackers, which is a phrase that it's a nautical phrase. You have people who haul the line and people who give out slack. People who were always giving out slack on the line were called slackers. So you've got people over here who would rather not put in effort to things. Excessive joy can basically make people lazy, but at a deep level, at a level that's more than just suck it up and do some work. It's a deeper thing. And we can treat it really effectively, and all of a sudden people start caring about stuff again, which is good.
So can I ask a question?
Sure.
So when you're talking about joy, you're not talking about any particular chi.
No. So, I mean, it's mostly going to be the heart chi that it affects, but it'll affect everything.
Right. But especially heart chi.
Well, so like, for example, I'll use the marijuana example here. Marijuana does a lot of things, but one of the things that it can do is cause excess joy. But marijuana as an herb goes to the liver, which means that going to the liver plus the excess joy causes slackening of liver chi. That will then affect the heart, but it's going to start here because that's where it's occurring. That makes sense? So you have to look at multiple factors to determine which chi is going to be affected. In the same way that like cold damages the kidneys, but if you get a cold invasion in the side of your head, it's going to damage the gallbladder channel where it enters. Eventually, it might affect the kidneys, but we have to look at both the parts of the body that are susceptible to the injury and where the injury happens to occur. That makes sense? Don't worry about getting this completely right now. This is it's a little more advanced than we need to be doing. I just want to get you guys to get some of the basic associations here, but I'm glad you're asking these questions.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple other private questions that I think I can read out loud here, but I'll leave out the names since they're private. How do you feel about us treating ourselves with acupuncture? I'm getting a mixed response from different professors. If you haven't taken a needle tech class, you should probably not treat yourself. If you have taken a needle tech class, then the school says that I should tell you not to treat yourself. Anecdotally, I treated myself and roommates while I was in acupuncture school. That may have been dumb and I may have been lucky. I would avoid any areas where you've gotten any warnings about anything for sure. You can definitely cup yourself. You can definitely do gua sha on yourself. Those are both easy. I mean, I think I've mentioned that I use a industrial car buffer for myself. Works great. Yeah, you can definitely do acupressure. I mean, we're not really teaching it to you here at the school, but you can do it. Ear seeds are great. They're easy. Yeah. Okay, one other question about, so in terms of treating yourself, I don't think anyone is giving you permission, but I also think that you can decide how much responsibility you want to take. Okay. Joy can lead to chi slackening, but joy is a fire element. Would it speed it up? I'm not sure how to connect this point. So yeah, so the joy, which like, this isn't quite accurate, but let's think of it this way, like adrenaline, endorphins will tend to, like, let's say, we got to use some inexact terminology here. Excite the chi and heart. So in the marijuana example, in the marijuana version of this, for example, let's just say THC affects the liver in some people, not always. You can get a lot of creativity out of this, which is a wood function, because you've accelerated and excited the chi. Then the next day, or after frequent use, sometimes you begin having less creativity as it weakens and slackens that area. So it's not that the joy causes the chi to slacken, it's that the joy causes a chain reaction that inevitably slackens the chi. Almost like overstretching a rubber band a bunch of times and then it doesn't really do the thing anymore. Yeah. I've got a follow-up to the question about treating ourselves. I was told the treatment would not be as effective. That is my experience as well. If you want to do orthopedic treatments on yourself, they can be very effective. If you want to do psycho-emotional treatments on yourself, I actually think the surrender aspect, the letting yourself go in the presence of another person and trusting them so that you can, there's a yin-yang relationship between practitioner and patient that you can't really get with yourself. That's my personal belief. You can have some nice things happen when you treat yourself, but I don't have the same level of profundity that I usually do when I'm treated by someone who's very good, who also isn't me. Okay, so let's try to get through some of the internal, external, miscellaneous stuff, and then we'll take a break. And then if there's more questions, we'll do those questions. And yeah, we'll just kind of keep moseying through here, okay? And if you guys have stuff that comes up, feel free to message me publicly, privately, whatever, and I'll keep answering these things. You guys can see my slides? Yep, good, okay. So these all are on the Moodle and on the Slack. These are last week's slides that we're just gonna finish up here. There was a question earlier in the chat that I apparently missed. 1 second. Sure. What's up, Jasmine? Last one, and then we're going to get into this. I think it's the opposite. The lack of joy would make something slack because there's nothing at the end of all that work. So why bother? No. That is a level deeper than we're going to be going here. We're not going to be talking about De and Ming and some of the other concepts that relate to things like motivation. I would give you the line from Nietzsche, he who has a why can bear any how. Oftentimes a lack of joy is a great motivating factor for people, interestingly enough. Okay, internal disease. So internal disease is caused by lifestyle. That's the big umbrella that we're going to be talking about here. And lifestyle is every single thing that a person does that they have the ability to not do, let's say. So someone's, let's say, resting heart rate isn't really something included here, but their breathing patterns are a part of their lifestyle. Their emotional patterns, their belief systems, physical activity, the rituals they engage in, their habits, everything. And there are different definitions for this. For example, Maciocia will say that internal diseases are just emotions and that diet is a miscellaneous cause of disease. I guess it's kind of academic. He doesn't really have a definition of internal disease that I like. So I'm defining it as all disease that can be prevented or affected through behavioral change. So if a person is generating an internal disease because all they do is lift weights for the front half of their body, we can change that by encouraging them to do compensatory exercise. And then I see miscellaneous disease as all disease which cannot realistically be prevented or affected. So that's, if you know that a restaurant in town has been giving people food poisoning, then you cannot go there and not get food poisoning. But usually that's not the thing that results in food poisoning. It's usually that we get surprised. So the first place to talk about this is habits. So everything you eat and drink can be a cause of internal disease. And again, we're not necessarily talking about something like diabetes here. We're often talking about things like anger issues. Exercise is what you do with your bodies. Biggest form of biggest supply of excess joy that I've seen in my practice, outside of drug abuse, is excessive exercise. Marathon runners tend to have slackened chi due to excess joy. Not always, but often. And then rituals, that's all other repeated behaviors. So things like obsessive compulsive disorder can fall under causes of internal disease in addition to being a disease itself, right? So if someone has obsessive compulsive disorder and has to wash their hands 100 times a day, then the obsessive compulsive, and then they get infections or dryness problems in their lungs due to what they've done to their skin, we can say that the obsessive compulsive disorder is both a disease and a cause of disease. I've been getting a bunch of questions about nutrition and diet from all of you, which has been lovely. So I've posted a bunch of materials on the Slack. I think I'll be adding another channel into the Slack specifically for this, but I have taught a semester-long nutrition course in the past. So if people are interested, refer to the Slack where we're talking about this. But I'm going to go over some of the basics here. This is going to be a little bit of a review from herbology, but this is also very important to get. So back to my lovely whiteboard. That didn't work. So all food, drink, everything has energetic qualities. And food, by food, I mean everything you take into your body. So that includes herbs, that includes beverages. There's semantics here, but for now, that's what we mean. All food has energetic qualities. Everyone here's taken Intro to Herbology, right? Have people not taken it now? Okay, so I'm assuming that you've been introduced to this. Let's find out if you have. Okay, so all food has a temperature from cold to hot. They all enter channels, which means, so like if it's a hot food, where are we going to see the heat manifest? Well, that's determined by which channels it enters. So lung, spleen, whatever, one of the channels. And they also have tropism or directionality, which means that they're going to go up, down, in, or out, or around, right? So when someone's taking in food, if they, let's say, what's a good example here? It's very obvious with some people that they're picky eaters, right? So someone who is a 10-year-old who's a pastatarian is not that uncommon, should be uncommon, but isn't. But sometimes you get adults who do things like, I only eat, or let's say, I love spicy food. I put hot sauce on everything. So what they're telling you is that they're always on one side of the temperature range, which means that either there's usually two options. One, they're treating a cold condition, but they don't know it. Or two, they're developing a heat condition, or both. This one's pretty easy to see as an outlying behavior. But if we combine this with exercise, which generates heat, with lots of time spent in saunas, with a lot of time being angry, which tends to generate heat, with a lot of alcohol, which tends to generate heat, which is why I call this the alcoholic chef archetype. I don't think Gordon Ramsay is an alcoholic, but that's kind of what you could picture here. Lots of anger, lots of heat, lots of red face, because they're consistently bringing in energetic qualities that are going to cause them to become imbalanced, right? So just like emotions, bringing in all of these energetic qualities over and over and over are going to affect the person's physical makeup. Because it's food, the first thing it's going to affect is the digestive system. So people who eat spicy food all the time, well, let's put it this way. If you watch an ad for prescription antacids on TV, what is the person always eating in the background?
Spicy food.
Barbecue, spicy
Oh,
food.
barbecue.
The person like with the wings being like, oh, my stomach hurts. And it's like, yes, that's correct. That's because you're eating foods consistently that do that. And it's common enough that we actually know this at the level of pharmaceutical prescription advertising. They know that the foods that cause this are foods that we would call hot foods. On the flip side of this, most vegan food tends to be cold, especially if you're going raw vegan. And so we tend to see a similar set of issues showing up in communities, people who eat imbalanced food in the cold direction. Instead of becoming angry, they tend to become drained and a little bit weak and depressed. So in those cases, we warm them up. In the alcoholic chef side, we cool them down. But the real point here is that any sort of continuously imbalanced diet is going to throw off the entire system and be a cause of internal disease. You guys are going to have a Chinese nutrition class. I would love to teach it. Talk to the school and see what would happen. You're going to have a Chinese nutrition class. That's where you'll learn about this. We've got some statements here under exercise. Quick hint for future quizzes and exams. You should know all of these sentences backwards and forwards. Page 273 refers to Machiocha's second edition. You should know all of these backwards, forwards, up and down, because you will probably be tested on this something like 10 times before you get your license. It's not that it's that important, it's that it's easy to test on and we all agree about it. So I will be testing you on it because you're going to be tested on it. So if you wonder why sitting for a long time begins to make your muscles sore, it's because it's damaging the spleen, for example. One of the corollaries to this is we can expect to see a multi-stage reaction occur. So someone who stands for an extended period of time, we're going to expect it to injure the bones, which means it's going to injure the kidneys, which means that when they get low back pain and knee pain from standing a long time, we need to ask whether it's qi and create another flow chart here really quick. We need to ask whether their issues are from, let me just transition. Long-term let's say, standing security guard. This is your patient. They stand for 8+ hours per day. Their chief complaint, low back and knee pain. If you hear low back and knee pain, you think kidney problems. We'll get into that later this semester. But it could also be just local qi and blood stagnation. If you've forgotten that excessive standing damages the kidneys, you might think that it's this and try to do a musculoskeletal treatment that makes them feel better for a few days, but then they're more drained afterwards. If you remember it's the kidneys, then you might be able to tonify the kidneys and have the problem not come back at all. That's just an example of why this is useful. So knowing what damages what behaviors damage what is helpful. If you have a patient, for example, with very severe anemia, or especially if it's heart blood deficiency, we might recommend that they rest their eyes. That feels silly until we point out that excessive use of the eyes injures the blood and the heart. This is also all from the Huangdi Neijing before it's from Machiocha, so we got a long history on this one. My personal approach to thinking about physical exercise, which I totally haven't been implementing because I've just been rehabbing my own injury for a little while now and just starting to be able to do more, is Katie Bowman's approach. She's got a couple of books like Move Your DNA. She's one of the people who's a big proponent of barefoot exercise. Mixed feelings about the barefoot exercise, but I like her idea of every physical activity is like a vitamin or a mineral or a nutrient. There's nothing wrong with sitting. The problem is sitting all day. Nothing wrong with standing. Even people who are constantly doing back bends and things like that, you can overdo it. So the question is, how much of each nutrient do you want? And then deliver that. You're going to learn some of this concept in Tai Chi or in Tui Na class, but frankly, not a ton of it. And you'll mostly have to learn that later if that's an area of expertise you really want to get into. Sexual activity, Chinese medicine really cares about sexual activity for men. They don't really care about it for women. We care about childbirth for women and see those two things as being kind of similar, that men lose some of their qi and yang and essence through sexual behavior, and women lose it through childbirth and through growing a child inside of them. You'll find a bunch of different charts saying if you're 24 and it's the summer, then you shouldn't have sex more than 5 times per week. But if it's the winter, it should only be 3. But if you're 45, and the best way to think of this is if you get tired if you or your patient or your partner gets tired after ejaculation, it's too frequent. Relaxed, sure. Tired is a sign of sudden kidney deficiency. So people who pass out after having sex, that's a sign that we probably need to build them up. And if you build them up, they tend to also, the whole thing works better. Let's just say it that way. This isn't something we're going to go into in basically any more depth than this here in this class, but you'll get some of this in some sexual health classes later on. If it's really overdone, it'll damage the person's jing or essence, which is a big problem. There are a couple of caveats for women. You'll learn about this when you take your OBGYN class, but the traditional rule of thumb is to avoid sexual intercourse during menstruation. There's nothing said about orgasms during menstruation, just not penetrative sex. The idea is that the Chong vessel, which you guys I don't think have gotten to, one of the extraordinary vessels, has to descend blood during this period, and having sexual activity, having penetrative sex during that time period can cause counterflow within the Chong, which can lead to local blood stagnation in the uterus, which can cause pain and potentially fertility issues just due to having stagnation in the area. And the second piece of this is not to have sex before the woman is fully developed. The idea being that in let's say the ages of the first menstruation to say 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there, while the person is still developing, having penetrative sexual intercourse can also cause similar counterflow, which can damage the full maturation. of the sexual organs. Very basic overview. You'll learn more about this. One of the ways that this shows up that's interesting is that if a woman is fairly deficient or doesn't have strong Jing, gets pregnant, and doesn't build up her qi and blood during the pregnancy, and then has a problematic childbirth where a lot of Jing and blood is lost, we see that as being one of the main causes of severe postpartum depression. That's preventable and treatable within Chinese medicine 80+% of the time. And when I say treatable, I mean within a week or two, it's mostly better. This is something that can ruin people's lives, so it's a good place to be able to do some good work. Rituals. So this one is a lot more complicated. This is something you're really mostly going to learn clinically. We expect different things to develop in terms of internal disorders for someone who watches TV for 3 hours every evening versus someone who plays the piano for 3 hours every evening versus someone who cooks dinner. If you're cooking dinner for 3 hours every evening, that's a lot. But someone who cooks dinner versus orders takeout, not only because of the nutritive quality of the food, but because of the creative process in cooking food, because of the energy that you can put into it, because what the process of, let's say, preparing meals does for your entire system. We see every activity, including every thought that people have, influencing how their qi moves. We don't have to know all of it to be able to work with people, but very often we'll see people who, let's say, generate a lot of heat through their food, also generate a lot of heat through their rituals. So someone who eats a lot of spicy food and then plays competitive online games that get them very angry, we're seeing them creating the same internal imbalance in multiple ways that seem disconnected at first, but are the same movements of qi. So we'll often ask people about what rituals they engage in so that we can know whether or not, so that we know the best way to help them. Let's pause. Yeah, we've got too many to go through here. Let's pause right here. I'm just going to stay on and take any other questions people have, but otherwise we will be back in 10 minutes at 2:25. But I will just be here taking questions if you have them until then. But we won't resume the actual class for 10 minutes. I'm just going to get some water. I'll be right back. Feel free to pop on the chat. I've got headphones in, so I can hear you if you ask a question.
Cool. Can you hear me then?
Yep.
Okay, cool. No, I was gonna ask, we took a class last semester with I forget his name, Bornya, Professor Bornya, and he talked about, he's super chill and super cool, and kind of talked about how there's such a lack of classes that cover like the sexual experiences of humans and that whole like part of us. That's a big part of us. And he was saying how PCOM, like the curriculum really doesn't have a lot of that, and to just be vocal about that to the administration, I guess. But this, what you're sharing now is kind of like, this is like, again, the first class that anyone's even talking about us as like sexual beings. And it's important. I just wonder why that's such a, like, is that the like Protestant overtone of the institution? Why that's so like kind of clean, and why that's removed?
I think the school is scared. Well, first off, people have different opinions on this. People have different perspectives, and there are different classical sources, and there are different conversations within Chinese medicine about what's correct and what isn't within this realm. And people get, it's challenging to just talk about emotions in the school. Once you start talking about sex, things get pretty complicated. So I would slightly disagree with Bornya, only in that the place this education happens is in the clinic. It happens when patients show up. It's not really a part of your overall education. And I think that's mostly because it's hard. I think it would be good to have an entire class devoted to, like, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks of the obstetrics and gynecology course devoted to this, but you very quickly get into bunch of Taoist practices and like the way that these sexual recommendations come down to us. It's like, well, this was talking to a king with a harem. How much of this is applicable to us today?
True.
It's a fuzzy area, and it's one we're going to have to get good at talking about at some point, but we are not currently good at talking about it.
But I guess I feel, yeah, that's an interesting point. Like I guess the like the relevance to the culture now. But I feel like, you know, like a lot of this stuff, there are parallels. Like if someone's talking about possession and stuff like that, or people being possessed by ancestors, it's like that there is a direct overlay to like how we see that now, and how what we call it and how we phrase it. I mean, that's all from like foundations. But I think that also applies to like things about sex. Like, yeah, there's no one with a harem, but is there? You know what I mean? Like, isn't there, you know, somebody who has tons of Tinder dates and who's out every night or has people over every night? I mean, there's definitely some overlay.
I agree with you. I think the biggest problem is that we're so bad at talking about sex as a culture right now that it's very hard to, like, for example, if Chinese medicine said women shouldn't have sex under 21, I don't know how I could teach that, right? Like within our current, there are aspects of the way that Chinese medicine talks about sex that sound like we're going back to the 1930s in terms of women's liberation. There are also aspects of it that sound like, you know, proper sexual activity is the way to reach enlightenment. Both of those extremes exist. And so it's hard to know where to teach without it being our own bias that we're just telling you, so I want to say, what I wanted to bring up here is like, here's the basic ways that we see damage occur. Here are some signs that something's going wrong, but I don't actually have a prescriptive recommendation. And I'm also trying to inoculate you guys against having like oh, well, you know, I had sex twice this week. I can't do it again until next month when the seasons change.
People getting really like taking it verbatim too much.
Yeah, I want people to know how to think it through as opposed to just answer it. But yeah, it's frustrating.
But isn't Chinese, I mean, TCM is also riddled with the competing conflicts between like Taoism and Confucianism. And if East Asian culture is largely Confucian and women are pretty repressed. So that's why probably you're going to see stuff about kings and their harems, because women are not encouraged to have multiple partners. They were just like, you know, in Korea, at least historically, like, you know, young women virgins were pretty much locked up in a house, and they weren't allowed to see visitors because they kept pure until they got married. So I don't, I mean, there's that's a big aspect of Asian culture.
Wow. And I'm sorry, I can't see who's talking, but that's a great point. That's why I feel like, because I mean, look at this in the last that's a whole new idea. I feel like it should just be something that's dedicated like a semester to at least, you know, not just like a few hours or even like a few slides. And that's not like a knock on this class, but it just seems weird that we can't like keep framing it to have a semester's worth of stuff of like, yeah, what it was historically. Let's talk about how that might have influenced the medicine itself or the recommendations around stuff. How would you do it now? Like, I think isn't that the whole way that we're going to move forward as an actual profession?
I guess what I'm trying to say is culturally, like TCM is, you know, sits within an Asian construct, and you know, Asians don't talk about sex they don't talk about sex openly, so that may be part of the problem.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So when I go back through the historical literature in Chinese medicine, let's say about herbology, and we get to the period in time where they're developing wind heat theory, I can take the good of the epidemiological knowledge that they gained and the treatment approaches they gained during that time and separate that functionally from the fact that they were binding women's feet. Like those two things don't have to both be in the same sentence there. But as soon as we start talking about proper relationships and relations between men and women, let alone men and men or women and women, it becomes very hard to tell what's mythology, cultural recommendation, or medicine. We run into the same thing with a lot of nutrition where like ginseng, how important is it? And how much was it marketed? Tiger bones, is that about merchants selling stuff or is that medicine? So there are these edge cases in herbology that we can look at fairly clearly, but when it comes to proper sexual behavior, my approach when talking about this with patients is just to look at what's happening in their body and then use that as a conversation of like, well, it looks like your kidneys are getting really drained. How often are you having sex? I probably wouldn't word it that way.
But I see what you mean.
The question.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like with that as well though, Peter, is like, if we take this surgical approach of like, okay, let's just extract the parts that work for us and leave everything else, like, you know, to take the meat, leave the bones, or the other way around. But if we do that, that means that the person who's doing that said operation, we still have to rely that that person has the right intentions, because I feel like you can take whatever bones. That's why I feel like it's better just to be like, here's the whole carcass and like, here's what happened. And then you all go in there and take the parts that you want, as opposed to being like, I'm bringing this to you already made and packaged and cleaned off. I could
not agree with you more. Your entire education in classrooms is going to be filtered through someone else. And when you get out of school and enter the world of continuing education, that changes. Right? So
Shouldn't it be the other way around?
Shouldn't it be the other way around? Whether it should or not, it isn't right now. You know, we got to get you ready for a board exam. So like I tutor for board exams. I have in the past. And one of the things that's interesting is people who go to 5-element schools have a ton of other information about how the body works that people who go to Pacific College don't have. Good, bad, right, or wrong, they get different information. They also have a hell of a time passing the board exam and usually have 2 to 3 courses just to study for that. We don't do that. You're going to get a little bit from a bunch of different places. You're hopefully going to learn a ton in the clinic. We have, I would say, the best clinic in the country. You know, not right now, but in general. There are a lot of clinics where good luck being busy. I talked the clinic into giving me a 4th patient on every shift when I was an intern.
Because you wanted more, or? Because
I was booked up for 7 months.
Oh.
It's like, yeah, give me more. Give me more. Give me all the patients possible. And I'm, you know, when this patient comes in, I had a patient who is a sex worker. Like, that's a good opportunity for me to have a conversation with my supervisor ongoing for 3 months while I saw this person about how this happened. I totally agree with you, but I think if we were to give the whole animal, it would be a 10-year course. It would be a 10-year program. It's not possible to do the whole thing. That would be fun for me, but I don't, you know, yeah. Can you recommend, okay, we got a few questions here in the chat. Quiz updates, no quiz this week. Maybe next week, I don't know. I mean, it feels rude to give you guys quizzes right now. I have time and energy to like chat with people on Slack, for example, but frankly, I don't have the time or the energy to go through Moodle and spend an hour putting a 10-question quiz onto that platform.
I didn't know it took that long. I thought you just gave it to somebody and then they did everything.
Sometimes. I'm trying to make that happen for the midterm, which is like 70 questions, but for the quiz is less so. Don't worry, there'll be a midterm review. We'll spend time on that. Quiz updates, currently none. Okay. If everything is a movement of qi, would you relate the protest to a movement of wood, anger, liver qi? At the acupuncture clinic I worked in Brooklyn, they associated COVID-19 with metal and fire. If this is the case, would you associate the rise in liver qi as a response to stagnation, quarantine, and influence of metal and fire? Sorry guys, just 1 second. I'll be right back. I think I got a delivery to grab at the door.
Karaya, is that how you say your name?
It's Kyria. Hey,
okay.
Is this on me?
Yeah. So like, I don't know if you ever seen the movie Joy Luck Club.
Yeah, I did. I saw it when it came out.
Yeah, that's pretty much like Asian view of women. Like, if there's the like really bad, distinction between like the women you marry and like people who become like, sex workers. When
Like
Asian
extremes.
women, Asian women, they don't want to be in that category. So to avoid it, they're not encouraged. They're, caught being like, just like in the movie, one woman, she was raped, but then like her family disowned her. That's not uncommon still.
Wow.
So that's the kind of cultural milieu we're working with TCM, because that even though that happened like 50 years ago, whatever, it's not that, I don't think the mindset's changed that much.
It's really, I mean, I'm fascinated by this. I watched when it was out, the series Marco Polo. Did you ever watch that?
Oh yeah, I saw that.
But there's all these like courtesans and like this whole like chambermaid vibe, and I thought that was really fascinating, and obviously it was just very sexy and stuff like that, but I also like wonder like how
that's only for men and it's only for the king.
Right. Okay, got it. I mean, but don't you feel like there had to have been women and whatever, Cleopatra and Nefertiti living that life too on the other side of it, like, but I mean maybe not in like not in Asian culture, but I'm wondering like there had to have been some empresses or that were doing their thing, or had their whole that had their whole thing, like.
Yeah, there was but it's still very like male dominated culture.
I'm like, let's highlight that part. Let's like uncover
that would take another cultural revolution.
Like,
well, it looks like we're getting a lot of them this year, so fuck it. Let's just keep going.
Women, like, sexuality is so oppressed in China. Like, even my mom, like, she's uncomfortable with saying the word period.
Wow.
That's how bad it is. Yeah.
And like, you're in your 20s or 30s, or?
I'm in my like 30s.
Mm-hmm.
So wow. It's just the whole culture is very different.
And then how about for you? Do you feel like you've kind of like gone far in the other direction, or are you kind of still kind of close to the fruit? Like,
I think I gone the opposite direction. Yeah. My parents are like, I want to be able to talk to my kids about like sex openly, like, actually learn about it, because my parents never taught me anything when I was growing up. So like period or anything like that, they never mentioned it. So everything was like a surprise. It was really bad.
Yeah, I was gonna say like a terrible surprise. Like, okay.
Okay, what is that?
And that's the danger, I think, of not educating, not like you said, like educating your children, whether it's about financial literacy or like sexual literacy or emotional literacy. Like when you don't do that, you just leave the world to do it for you. And it's like, then you can't be mad at what they learn, because it's like, you didn't take the moment to like carve this out and have the uncomfortable conversation with me. Now I'm learning how to like do something completely illegal, or I'm learning how to do this because I just thought I had to figure it out on my own. And I think that's the risk that, parents run, and that's the responsibility that we have as generations, even if you don't have kids, the mentoring and stuff like that,
I agree.
Even in Korea still, and I'm American, I came here when I was 3 and I'm like almost 50 now, but there's a big problem. If a woman has a child out of wedlock, she becomes a social pariah. And children get left at orphanages so the women can like have a life and maybe get married but they can't know about like any past children.
Wow. And those children, like if she decides to keep the children, the children just get that same energy from the society as a whole? Or
if she wants to be in this, enter society, she can't have like illegitimate children.
Yeah.
Wait, what'd you say, Z?
You basically abandon your child.
Yeah, like. that happens a lot in Korea, and it sounds like in China too.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry about that, everybody.
In TCM, they do have a lot of good treatment for like women health issues. Like they're great with like period, menopause, a lot of things like fertility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, that's
We're
good.
really good at women's health. We're really good at it. It's just as soon as we actually start talking about sex, it's hard to talk about, but we're actually still good at treating problems around it. It's just the theoretical side is fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you guys for being patient here. Okay, so the question was about if everything's movement of chi, can we talk about like world events as movement of chi? Not only can we talk about world events as movement of chi, we're not really going to right now, a little bit maybe, Not only can we though, we can talk about countries as having constitutions. We can talk about organizations having constitutions. We could talk about the difference between Democrats and Republicans within the frame of movements of Qi. What is it that they care about? Like the idea of a progressive is more of a wood phase person, is more of a wood
What would
phase
you say
thing.
about Donald Trump?
I'm not going to say anything about Donald Trump. I want to be very cautious here, regardless, like, just like around sexual behavior, in the clinic, you can ask me my opinion about these things. In the class, I want to try to keep this just talking in generalities.
Understood.
Yeah. Understand I have personal feelings, but it's inappropriate for me to be putting them on you. What we can say though is like progressive people who are more interested in, let's say, novelty and new things and moving forward, that's more of a wood motion. It's more of a growing outwards. The conservative impulse is more metal. It's that what we have, what we need, we already have. It's more of a question of purifying what we have so that we can extract the good. If we want to talk about the protests, yeah, it's wood and aspects of fire. Like if you look at some of this is not a judgment of the protest, it's just the reality of group violence a lot of times, is that there's an aspect of joy and togetherness that happens during riots and protests in that sort of a way. This like similar to what happens at a large music festival when everyone's in this exact same flow together. The same thing happens in a more violent way during a protest or a riot, which is one of the reasons people love them, some people. So we could talk about that as being wood. I talk about the US as having been in an extended Earth phase that it probably shouldn't have been in for a long period of time, and that's beginning to break down, which is what we're getting a lot of these things from, and wood is good. We need multiple elements at once right now, which is a little bit of a problem because we're not very flexible as a country. So we'll see. But yeah, we can definitely think about it in that sort of a way. Would I associate the rise in liver qi as a response to stagnation? 100%, 100%. I mean, one of the reasons that these protests are the size that they are is because there's more people who are more desperate and feeling more oppressed than normal. That's not a statement about whether or not the protests are justified, but usually on Monday, a lot of the protesters have to go back to work, and they don't right now, and they're worried about other things. You know, people are a lot more likely to protest a major injustice when they also think they have less to lose. I think a lot of people feel that way right now. Again, whether or not they actually are, they feel that way.
Do you think with the COVID-19, everyone being like indoor and quarantined like so long by themselves, to kind of like make the energy even more?
Yeah, I also think it can't possibly be only a coincidence that the main chant of this protest is "I can't breathe." Like that's how I've felt to a very minor degree compared to some of the other things that are going on, but I've felt that for a few months. It's like we can't breathe in public, we can't breathe with our friends, and now we see a massive and horrific expression of that. It triggers the fact that we as a country can't breathe right now for a different reason, but that doesn't really necessarily matter to the people in it. Okay. Yeah, you bottle people up too long, they explode. Yeah, I'm not going to go any further into that.
There's so much looting in the city. Like Chinatown is destroyed.
Yeah, it's pretty bad near my apartment too. My girlfriend, my wife, recent wife, took a bike ride through Soho today. It's pretty bad. I'm tempted to go down rabbit holes with this, but I would like to keep going with the class a little bit. I understand. I understand though. Yeah. Professor Karen, you briefly mentioned cupping and gua sha. Are these techniques we'll learn later during our education at PCOM? Boy, you'd better. Yeah, they're still teaching that. They must be. They're both great techniques. I use cupping a lot more than I use gua sha. I use cupping all the time. It's arguably my most used self therapy. It's great. It's great. Bleeding cups are amazing. You're not going to learn those because the school doesn't want to deal with that much blood. Not that it's that much. They don't like dealing with any blood. But yeah, it's great. You learn those things in clinical techniques. I don't know the name of the class. You learn them soon. Yeah, you can absolutely use them for your beauty regimen. I was working with Chinese Medicine That Works, which is a continuing education organization, back in November to set up a class for teaching facial rejuvenation from the person who's the main alternative Chinese medicine beautician for all of Victoria's Secret. And he does a ton of facial cupping as part of the beauty regimen. Not to the point that you get bruises, because it can be a complicated practice. Okay, let's get through some slides here, and then but keep bringing up the questions. Like this is a week when I'm relatively comfortable meandering a little. So talking about rituals, you're not really going to learn a lot about people's rituals in school, but you will just start. I just want you to know about this so you can pay attention. You know, when you're sometimes the answer to your patient that has insomnia is that they need to not be on electronics after 8 p.m. because it excites their chi. Like we can talk about like melatonin cycles and people's circadian rhythm, but within Chinese medicine, it's like, no, you're using the eyes, you're stimulating the heart, you're stimulating the person's chi and blood, you're accessing the wood element in that person, which makes them want to grow up and outwards. All of these are not signals that you want when it's time to go to bed. And we can work with them that way. But there's too much within this basket of rituals to be able to really teach it systematically. So you're just going to learn it as you go along, but make sure you pay attention. To the person asking whether or not I'm drinking a 2-liter Arnold Palmer, I wish I was drinking a 2-liter Arnold Palmer. No, it's a dandelion tea, which is very helpful for a lot of digestive stuff. Yeah, one of the best things you guys can do for self-care right now is support your own earth, which is the thing that's going to make you flexible through chaos. So this, for me, it's dandelion tea is pretty good for people who tend to digestive excesses. So for me, it kind of works like a digestive cleanser without having to do anything extreme. Okay. Gua sha is a beauty regimen. Can be, especially with jade. There's a whole classical thing around that. I know some people who've had really good success with even things like cystic acne, just from jade gua sha. It's not really. I don't do a lot of that. I do. I actually have done some beauty related treatments, but I just have a bunch of tricks to make people's eyes really, really bright and pop using body acupuncture, not facial. Any recommendations to support our earth during this time? Do lots of things where you're moving very slowly, like hot baths if you can. Soak your feet in hot water. If during the day you can get outside and get to parks and get your feet in the earth, do it. If you can get to the beach, do it. Don't take risks, but try to get out into nature a little bit and then do nothing once you're there and deal with the chaos that happens when you do nothing. Eat simple, healthy, clean food. Rice, steamed vegetables, a little bit of meat would be the diet I would recommend for most people right now. Congee, good. Avoid cheap, easy, fast food, which is what I think a lot of people are eating right now, would be my guess, because can't be bothered with all this other stuff. It's too much. White rice, steamed vegetables, a little bit of whatever sauce you want, a little bit of meat if you want it, egg on top. Yeah. Congee is good. Sun tea is great. Sure. But yeah, the main thing that you can do to support your earth is just limit the amount of stimulus you have. Stay unstimulated as much as you can, because it's just, don't drain yourself, or else all of a sudden you'll start finding yourself with massive sugar cravings to compensate. Okay, So you're not really, mental activity, everything you think creates movements of qi within your system. I have gotten into some interesting rabbit holes with some other professors about whether our thoughts move the qi or the movements of qi create the thoughts. You can kind of go back and forth where it's getting abstract enough at that point that I don't really care to nail it down. I'm more interested in what the patient's experiences are, and then I'll work with them there. You're not really going to learn any of this in school, but this is where we start talking more about Chinese medicine psychology. You're going to learn patterns and what they do to the psychological state, but this is where books like Dragon Rises, Redbird Flies come in, and the work of Thea Elijah that I mentioned last week. There's a lot of people working in this space right now because Western medicine is bad at this, and we're at least better. But you're not going to learn much of this in school because TCM, we were talking earlier about TCM on the break. One of the things that wasn't mentioned is that TCM is Taoist and Confucianist and communist. And anything that didn't fit within the Chinese philosophical framework during Mao's revolution got taken out of the medicine. So a lot of stuff within the category of mental activity is not discussed. It didn't make it over that gap because there are a lot of concepts like balancing the proper amount of independence versus dependence within a culture. That idea didn't make it through. So TCM doesn't really do mental activity well. You're gonna have to go other places to learn Chinese medicine psychology.
Is there any initiative, because the Cultural Revolution was over technically by 1976, and they have been very open to, revive lots of traditions. So is there any kind of initiative in perhaps go back into this aspect of the medicine and develop it and talk about it and research it?
Yes and no is my answer. Yes, no, and I don't know are my three answers here. There definitely is. A lot of stuff doesn't make it into English. That's one of the issues. We seem to still be more focused, for good or for bad, on translating older texts that we still don't have. Like, we really only got what I would consider a very good translation of the Huangdi Neijing, like, in the past 10 years. So in English, we're a little limited on what we're getting. I've seen a bit of stuff come out, especially in Japan, around this, in looking in the, like, kind of, let's say 80s and 90s business culture of Japan. A lot of stuff came out around traditional medicine using the same underlying philosophy, more or less, on how to treat people who are going through burnout, depression, all sorts of mental and emotional issues. I don't know a lot about what's coming out of China right now. There's a ton of work going on in the US and in Germany in English on this. As far as I know, this is not something that's really being done in China, but I could easily be wrong. Okay. We also look, one of the things we look for are recurring thoughts or recurring thought patterns. So the person who always comes in and you say, how are you doing? They say, I'm just worried today. I'm worried about the weather. I'm worried about the protests. The next week, I'm worried about it being too hot. In the fall, I'm worried about winter coming. The patient who's always reporting to you the same sort of thoughts, the person who always has something that they're angry about, the person who's always worried, the person who's whatever. If you watch the way your patients communicate to you, one of the ideas that I like in Chinese medicine is that every single thing your patients do is a signal that they're trying to give you. I had a conversation a couple months back with a friend of mine who's an acupuncturist who was treating a woman for low back pain. The woman would come in, like, late 60s, came in to get her low back pain treated. After like 3 weeks, she was just complaining, like, I'm too tired to do these low back treatments. I don't want to do them, but yeah, I'm here for the low back pain, but that's just so tired. And my friend was calling me and saying, like, I'm having trouble with this patient because they're just complaining all the time. They're here for the low back pain. They don't want to do anything. Their chief complaint is that they're tired. At least it is this week. The fact that they can't spell that out to you in a language that we would like them to, it doesn't look like a textbook. Yeah, that's frustrating, but your patient is saying over and over, I'm tired. So just hear that and take it in the best you can. They might not be able to say that that's actually their problem, but they might be able to complain about it. Almost at the end of these ideas here, the person's beliefs matter a ton as well. So a patient who believes at a deep level that people are generally trustworthy is going to have a very different energetic makeup than someone who believes that everybody's a con artist. You have people who have both of these beliefs on different extremes. The people who believe that people are generally trustworthy are going to have much better access to the wood phase, the wood element. Their ability to go out into the world in an exploratory manner is going to be a lot higher. Their ability to form new relationships, get new partners, have new business ventures, whatever, all of that's increased. People who believe that basically people aren't good, basically people are bad, basically people are out to get you, are going to have a much harder time stepping out in that sort of a way. They're going to have more of a metal focus. If you have a patient whose nature seems to be largely metal, but they're coming to you because they feel really creatively blocked around writing a book, for example. Okay, well, we have a belief system about the world that's pulling you inwards, and you've got a creative activity where you want to go outwards and do things. How do we balance these? These are usually actually surprisingly easy to change. Okay, we're just going to do a little bit more here, and then got a couple other questions that are popping up. Okay, worldview is the last one here. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on in the semester when we get to the nourishing life part of the class, in theory. But this is more the answers to the big unanswerable questions. Why your patient believes they're here on this planet, what they believe the point of their life is going to influence what they do, and those beliefs change their energetic makeup. We do a lot of the 5-element Worsley stuff is about this. This is where we kind of start seeing people's constitution. I've actually found a lot of this pretty easy to work with when there's problems, and that's usually by doing a yes and to this. So this is where people who have like a Buddhist background might say like life is suffering. And you can often help people open up their worldviews by just saying it is suffering. It's also other things. That tends to be decently well received. Okay. So internal disease, just as a summary here, internal disease is going to be all the diseases that can be produced through behavioral change. And we just went through a bunch of types of behaviors, from beliefs to food to exercise to actions that people engage in. This is the most important part of disease theory. We care about this way more than external disease. And this is what you're going to be doing for basically the entire diagnosis and treatment of disease series that you'll be taking. And this is also where disease prevention occurs. This is where predictive abilities lie. This is where we can talk to someone about what's going on and with high degrees of accuracy, guess what was happening a month ago. This is really the core of Chinese medicine. And it's where all of this anatomy and physiology and pathophysiology pays off, so that when someone comes in and they start explaining a very weird thing that's happening, we can connect all the dots and be like, oh, that's because the lung did this and the kidney did that, and then because of that, this didn't get done, and we wrap all that together, find the place that we can interact with the system, and then it changes the entire thing. That might sound complicated. It starts off that way, but it gets easier. My grandfather's. Oh, cool. Okay, how do you know if someone's nature is metal? I would not worry about that for now, because that is a hard thing to answer. And if you don't have the foundation very well, it can be very easy to just start mapping biases onto people. I don't particularly like the concept of people having constitutions at all. And the Worsley people would say, of course, that's how you feel. You're a Senjiao type. So I've mixed feelings about that entire way of thinking, but there are a lot of people who would be happy to share information about that. Is there any belief about reincarnation in TAM? I assume TAM stands for TCM. And no, that was taken out by the Maoists. A lot of the Taoist roots of TCM were removed during the Cultural Revolution, and if they've made their way back in, I'm not aware of it. But if you go back into older texts, there are plenty of people who talk about that as a concept. I wouldn't say that it's like wholly canonical within TCM or within Chinese medicine, but there are certainly strong, frequent believers in that concept. And therefore, a lot of people who put work into figuring out how that would work. The spirits and the souls in Chinese medicine don't get talked about a ton in TCM. That's where we see the ideas like reincarnation occur, which are usually gross oversimplification. Again, many pieces of us, they leave, they reconstitute with other pieces. So there's aspects of us that do continue and would get reincarnated in forms with different mixtures. It's a very different concept of a soul than we have within a Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay. Let's get through the miscellaneous causes of disease, and then we'll take another break. This part's kind of fun, and we can whip through this a bit. So what are miscellaneous causes? We're going to put some of the constitutional stuff in here. So things like type 1 diabetes tends to be a miscellaneous disease. A lot of birth defects, genetic inheritance issues, height. A lot of trauma is a miscellaneous disease. Poison, bug bites, drugs, and mistreatment. Those are going to be the categories we cover today. Mistreatment is an interesting one. If we look at the Shanghanlun, the book that goes over wind cold and how wind cold happens, about half of the book, a little bit more, is devoted to what you do if someone else did the wrong thing in treating them. So we care a lot about doctors who screwed up. And we see that sometimes. In fact, there are conditions in the Shanghanlun that look like mistreated stomach flus today, where people get things like ongoing diarrhea that they can't get rid of after taking antibiotics. The first thing to say about miscellaneous diseases, send the people to a doctor. Most of the time, that's the correct answer for this stuff. If people's lives are in danger and you haven't trained in how to work with that extensively, you just send them to a doctor. This is one of the areas that Western medicine is great at. They've put a lot of time into figuring out how to deal with accidents. Chinese medicine has put time into that, but less so in contemporary American practice, at least. The idea is that we're born, so Constitution, we're born with stuff already here. There's some people like Jeffrey Yuen who go really deep into this, who start with like the blessing coming down from heaven with the yin and yang joining of the mother and father, and go through every step of fetal development that there is, go through all of the extraordinary organs, their formation, their function as a blueprint in the system, to the creation of the extraordinary meridians, and how they begin creating a map that determines everything from gender to how tall you'll be to your eye color, and then all the way into the creation of the 12 channels. But that really only matters if you really care about that stuff. And most of the time in our practice, it's not really super relevant. If you want to learn about it at some point, I encourage it. But for now, you're just born with a bunch of stuff, and there's a bunch of argument about how much we can change that. Over time, the idea in Chinese medicine has gone from you can't change it to maybe you can change it some to sometimes it looks like we can change this quite a bit. The same idea was there for whether or not you can tonify someone's jing, whether or not you can increase their essence. It used to believe that no, you get what you get and don't screw it up. And then, like, my understanding is somewhere around 1200, it was kind of like, well, maybe we can actually do a little bit here. And now we're at the point where, yeah, you can strengthen someone's jing. A bit of the Constitution conversation gets relegated to Chinese astrology and Chinese matchmaking and all sorts of background information about the parents. So it can get a little fuzzy, which parts of this are medicine, which ones are more religion, which ones are more spirituality, which ones are more folklore. There's definitely overlap, but it gets hard to tell what is worth keeping, what only functions in 5th century China, what maybe never functioned there. So this is a challenging conversation, but I would recommend checking out Lillian Bridges' work. I mentioned her last week. It's a useful way to start seeing a little bit of that conversation presented, I think, quite artfully. The next one is trauma. We are so good at physical injuries. Injuries cause stagnation of qi and blood. It can also cause shock, which we listed as one of the emotions, right? We treat these as branches. So if someone gets hit by a car, we don't have a deep underlying root that we have to deal with. What we have to deal with is the stagnation that got created in their body. We use all of our tools for this. Like, more than any other condition, physical trauma is when we bust out the whole toolkit. I bleed people all the time for this stuff. It's great. Like swelling going down in front of your eyes while moxing people. The sooner you get to them, the better. We've got herbs that are amazing to take internally at the moment of trauma, herbs to take 12 hours later, a day later, 36 hours later. We're long history and very good at this. If someone's injury is bad enough, that's not your job. They go to a doctor and then they come to us. If you think someone's bone is broken, they go to a doctor and then they come to us. Or you toss some herbs in their mouth, send them to the doctor, and then they come back to us if you know what you're doing. This is the best book I know to start off on this subject. It's a paperback. It's not a textbook. Super readable. I built a quick weekend class off of this. It's like, this is, if you've got friends who do martial arts and are always bruised or always have some injuries, this is what you should get them for Christmas. Like, strong recommendation. And fun if you're into injuries. If you want to do any sort of sports medicine, this is also where you probably want to start. Yeah, the treatment of injuries and sports medicine have a large overlap. I want to just highlight here, we're really good at topical medicines, oils, creams, salves, jiaos, plasters. We have the best set of options for this that I'm aware of by a long shot, by a long distance. So yeah, and this book tells you how to make them. We have the category of poisonings. We're going to talk about a little bit of this later on in the semester, but this is everything from, you know, lead in your pipes to black mold in your closet to, I have a friend who I've been trying to get to go to an acupuncturist who specializes in some of this stuff because they worked in at the Whitney doing art restoration work, and they got poisoned from the chemicals that they were working with. This is a hard category. Different poisonings work differently. We've got some great stuff we can do, but we've got some places where we kind of throw up our hands. It's a challenging category, but there's some interesting stuff here. And you're not really going to learn about this in school, and that's okay, because this is mostly referring out. We got a lot of stuff we do for parasites, but we pretty much just refer people out. We've got herbs that have anti-hemolytic functions, anti-parasite functions, but we usually send them to the Western medical system. If you do this for parasites, you would do well to make sure that they find someone who specializes in tropical medicine. That is the branch of Western medicine that cares about this. Most Western doctors are largely not trained in this subject at all, and often don't even really know what to do when they get someone presenting this way. You're looking for a tropical medicine specialist. So on parasites, we don't have a lot to say. There are specialists. You can learn a lot from them on this subject, but it's not part of your standard education, and that's okay. We do have quite a bit for bites as well. We're going to talk about GU syndrome later on in the semester, which is the current best model I am aware of for looking at things like chronic Lyme disease. Yeah, in acute situations, we're just helping to heal in a similar way to a lot of trauma. We're just also using herbs and points which help, which provide an antitoxin function. We have topical herbs for this, but we don't really use this because people just don't get bit that often. We care about ticks. That's about it in a day-to-day practice, unless you're specializing, in which case I'm probably not your person, because I just don't know a ton about this. The next one's drugs. So let's talk for a second about what drugs are. We're just going to spend a minute on this. So the question I'm going to pose to you guys is, what's the difference? Food, herbs, drugs. There are a couple different ways to look at this question. We could say like a drug is a purified substance of something, but you know, I would put ayahuasca over in this category. I'm not using drugs pejoratively. It's not a negative statement. Ayahuasca is a combination of different herbs, much in the way that we blend them, actually. There's a bit of crossover in the theory of the construction of an ayahuasca formula. But I mean, you could call it an herb, but I think it's a little bit further over in its function. And the basic idea here is how strong is what we're talking about. So food, slow acting, gentle in its effect, large doses long term. Herbs, drugs, fast, aggressive, very small doses, short term. And herbs are in the middle. Obviously an oversimplification. There are plenty of herbs that are very dangerous that you take once or twice and you're done. There are plenty of drugs you take in low doses forever. But when we're talking about the taking of drugs in the disease-causing sense, what we mean is a person who ingests a fast, aggressive, short-term change to their system. Someone who takes a substance into their body that's able to wreak havoc quickly. So a person who was cold 1 week and you've been slowly warming them up for 6 months, and then they do a ton of cocaine over the weekend and they come in and all of a sudden it's all heat signs and their presentation is completely different, that's a drug. So when we say drugs as a cause of miscellaneous disease, what we mean is people taking in inappropriate, fast-acting, powerful substances. So ayahuasca would count in this sort of a way as well. And there are lots of things that we would normally call herbs that function in this sort of a way as well. It just means people who take extra strong substances that are inappropriate. But you'll usually see it listed as drugs. That makes sense? Good. Seeing some thumbs up. Herbs and drugs can't sustain our body nutritionally. This is also true. So one of the things we talk about in a nutrition class is what's the difference between a nutrition class and a herbology class. The difference is how fast it works. And when we're using food, we always have to be thinking about tonification. With herbs, sometimes we do things that only remove things from the person's body, but when we're talking about food, you have to always be building the person up to some degree. That make sense? We got just a little bit more on this subject. We haven't gotten through a ton today, but that's just fine. We still have more time. I'm jumping the gun. Mistreatment is a huge category. I would argue that if you're in the clinic and you have a patient whose chart is this thick and it's their third one, they've probably been mistreated. So we have treatments that can help reset patients who have been mistreated. you can talk to your clinic supervisors and get recommendations for things that just, let's just wipe the slate clean so we're starting with a fresh system. In this case, for an example of a mistreatment would be, let's bring that whiteboard back up. Mistreatment. So, what's a good example? Okay. So here we've got the skin, soli, the space in between. This is where Wei Qi is. And then we've got muscle. If a wind cold comes in and gets stuck in the soli, the correct treatment is to expel it. The incorrect treatment is to close it into the person's body and lock it in there, or to draw it further into the muscle layer. These things, the closing off and the pulling in, are both easy to do. So is the pushing out, but if the person's mistreated and now we have a wind cold stuck in the muscle layer with the skin closed off, we can't just expel, we have to open that up first and we have to vent the muscle layer and then we can push this out. So very often, and that doesn't have, that set of things doesn't really happen naturally. Someone has to, they may have done something that caused it, but someone did something that caused that set of things to occur. So then we go in and we figure out, okay, in this unnatural thing, not just, so we have pathological, but there are plenty of pathological things that happen naturally. This is, mistreatment means unnatural and pathological. So often when we see something that's a mistreatment, the first reaction we have as practitioners is, what the hell happened here? How, this doesn't make any sense. And then as we start figuring out what they've done, it's like, oh, you had poor digestive issue, you had low stomach fire, and you responded to that by taking Senna tea twice a day for a month and a half. Okay, that was the opposite of what should have been done. So now we have a weird situation to sort through. Okay, we're almost done with this, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to go a little further into today's. I think I'm mostly just reporting that to myself. Okay, so a lot of the Shanghai Mun's devoted to mistreatment. Yeah, so just to recap the miscellaneous causes of disease, it's all the weird stuff, all the stuff we can't control, and all the things that people do that are to themselves and to others that are just real incorrect. We see some of Chinese medicine's blind spot in these disorders because anything that we can't fit into a different category tends to end up here. So like we don't have a good understanding of parasites from a Western medical perspective. So we just toss them all in here, regardless of the fact that they're very different at different times. There's specialists in different areas here, people who really know a lot about the individual things, the individual categories. But yeah, most of the miscellaneous is, I'm only treating it once it becomes trauma. So like if a person had a dog bite, you're going to the hospital, you're going to get all that checked out, and then you're going to come to me and we're just going to work on tissue repair. So the last piece of this is like, we have herbs that treat appendicitis and sepsis pretty decently. You should still call 911 and send them to the hospital, because if your herbs don't work or you make things worse, you're then out of options. Whereas if they're in a hospital, they can be rushed to surgery. There's more that can be done. That's on the ethical side with your patient. On the personal side, if you overstep your bounds, you are going to potentially get your pantsuit off. And you don't want that. And also then have guilt and shame and bad dreams and feel like a bad practitioner for the rest of your life. So don't treat people incorrectly. Yeah, okay, let's take a break for 10 minutes. and then we're going to come back and go into some new stuff today, post some questions while I'm gone, and we'll answer those, and then we'll get into the rest. Okay, so we're going to dive into the slides that I actually posted for this week. This is good that we've put some especially hard topics aside for next week, where hopefully things will be better. But we can spend a ton of time on it next week. I'm going to send you guys some pre-reading at Acupuncture I'm going to want you to do before next week to hopefully make some of the concepts easier. But the rest of today shouldn't be too bad. So this is familiar, right? Postnatal chi production. You guys remember this. We're going to just do a little review here and talk about, so this is emergence and propagation. We're going to talk about why do people get sick? How do they get sick? We've talked about types of disease, categories of disease, but now how? And to start that off, we got to talk about chi. So this image should be reviewed from last semester, but I want to highlight these parts that I've circled that you probably didn't spend much time on when you were going over this subject, which is the nutritive versus defensive chi. So the Wei chi is the main thing we care about for whether or not we get sick. Chi deficiency, okay. When we look at this chart, we've got the spleen, we've got the lungs, we've got the gathering chi in the chest, the original chi up from the kidney. So we kind of put heart right in here and kidney down here. And what that means is that if we get chi deficiency, it can come from multiple different directions. The first is not enough production. So if we think of chi, so here we've got the big bucket of chi. Right? We're constantly putting things into this through food and air. They also have to be digested by the spleen and the lungs. So great food with a weak spleen doesn't really do anything. Great air, but poor breathing patterns doesn't really do anything either. All of this is going into the bucket of the person's chi. And then over here, we've got a spout coming out of it, right? And this spout represents activities. Or, well, let's get more technical than that. Those uses of chi. And if a person is chi, so normally, like let's say this is a healthy level across here. There's a deficient level here. How do we get from healthy to deficient? We're either losing too much or making too little, right? So if a patient is using the normal healthy amount of energy a person would use, but they're not eating enough or breathing properly, then we'd expect them to become deficient, right? The bucket will drain because there's too much coming out of it. The flow is open too large. This could be due to someone not sleeping. This could be due to someone over-exercising. There are lots of ways, too much sexual activity. There are lots of ways that this can happen. Alternatively, they're using just fine amount of chi for their constitution, but they're not making enough. And that's either because the spleen is weak, the lung is weak, the food is bad, the air is bad, or any of the other things that we've talked about really in the, well, no, just those things. So when we're talking about chi deficiency, we need to look at that entire little flow chart and recognize that any of the things in that can be the cause that we have to deal with and confront. So, oh yeah, and of course, over by the spigot, we also have pathogens. So if you have a pathogen that's also using your chi, that would be almost like a second hole in the bucket here. And we just kind of got that listed out over the next few slides as a reference, right? These are the types of qi that we use to make qi, right? We need spleen and stomach qi, we need lung qi, we need yuan qi from the kidneys, and we need food and we need air. And we're talking about the digestive system. And every one of these things we can go deeper and deeper into. So let's take, someone here isn't muted and is eating. And if you would like to mute yourself, I would appreciate that. So we take this, let's just zoom in on spleen and food, okay? So there are multiple ways that this system can go wrong. Hopefully, this puts out gu qi, right? That's what we're looking to have happen. But when the food comes into the person's body, we're just going to change spleen here to spleen, stomach. The food has to go through a number of processes. The food itself doesn't contain gu qi. It contains qi, but it's not what we're looking to put out at the other end. It's got to go through a process. The first part is the stomach has to rot and ripen the food. If it doesn't rot and ripen, then the food is not properly prepared for the spleen, which is going to transform and transport that food, this rotted and ripened stuff. So the food comes in its physical form. You have a banana. You chewed the banana, you swallowed the banana. Within a Western medical context, the stomach acid has to break this down. Within a Chinese medicine aspect, the stomach has to rot and ripen this. So if it's a green banana, we're going to be putting extra effort into the ripening side. If it's a very dense, heavy food, like a steak, we might be putting more effort into the rotting side of it. But either way, the food has to be prepared, has to be transformed from this, has to be processed into something that the spleen can turn into gu qi. That's what transform means here. It takes the rotted and ripened product, transforms it into gu qi, and moves it along its pathway to where it's going next. These two organs are in charge of all of that function. There's more to it after that. We're going to go another pass on this in a few weeks, where we'll get into the small intestine and the large intestine and all of those things. But for now, if the stomach is weak, that's getting off the board. A weak stomach, so let me say that correctly. If we have stomach qi deficiency, aka a weak stomach, then we're not going to have rotting and ripening happening properly. Which might end up with undigested food in the stool, for example. It's the rotting and ripening part that will make it stop looking like food, after we've chewed it, of course. On the other hand, if the stomach is okay and can rot and ripen, and the spleen is weak, we're going to have gu qi, instead of going up this way, just drain out of the person's system. It's supposed to be picked up, lifted up to the chest, and instead its natural process would be to drain down through the rest of the digestive organs. So step 1, rot and ripen. Step 2, transform and transport. If the spleen and stomach are not sufficiently strong, these will not happen, and we will not produce gu qi at all.
What does it look like when it's going down? What do you mean with that?
If we think of this as being like If the spleen doesn't do its job, then the clear descends with the turbid. The good stuff goes with the bad stuff. All of the things that we would want to get out of what ultimately becomes feces just stays there. That's what it looks like.
Like, what does that mean though? Like, how does that manifest? Do you mean like indigestion or like? I'm trying to
In this case, if we're talking about this with spleen deficiency, we're probably going to see diarrhea. But what this might manifest as is general qi deficiency. So the question that I'm trying to get at here is, if your patient, I can spell, patient diagnosed with qi deficiency, then we want to know why. So if they have qi deficiency, we've already diagnosed them. Don't worry about the how of that. You have other classes that'll show you that. Once we know that they have it, we want to know why. And I'm saying that it could be the stomach not working properly. It could be the spleen, in which case all of that qi that we want, they're just pooping it out. This is often the person who's, taking gut bacteria supplements, who's taking probiotics, who's taking digestive aids, who's taking digestive enzymes, who's doing all of these sorts of things. Like, well, what about if we strengthen the spleen? Some of those things can, some of them can hurt the spleen. This should be largely review. Like, you guys covered some of this last semester, right? I'm seeing mostly lack of movement. So, okay, we'll go a little further here. Next, we've got the lung, and we're going to go through every organ individually a little bit later this semester. And when we do that, we're going to go a little deeper on this as well. So we're going to talk about the spleen for like an hour. We're going to talk about the small intestine, large intestine. We're going to go over every organ individually. So if this feels like a quick first pass, it's because it is. For the lungs, we've got the same idea, right? So we have our same Pac-Man character, right? Except this time, we're talking about air. And the air comes into the person's system and goes down to the lungs. And then the lungs extract the Da Qi out of that. In the same way, if the air is of low quality, especially low quality, there's not going to be Da Qi to extract. If there's something wrong with the lungs, like lung qi deficiency, then some percentage of the Da Qi will not get extracted, and the person will produce less qi. Yeah. If the lungs don't do, so the spleen and stomach can completely not work, and we just have diarrhea. And we spend a ton of time talking about how to work with the spleen and stomach to make sure that they work, because there's a lot we can do there. We don't spend a ton of time talking about what happens if the lungs don't work, because our patients die too quickly in that situation. Instead, we talk about how to improve this. So we're looking at, if we've got lung qi deficiency leading to general qi deficiency, using, then the way to fix their general lethargy might be just to tonify their. So like this might be as simple as regularly needling lung 9. If instead it's the digestive system, then maybe we're looking more at stomach 36, spleen 3, moxa, ren 12, something like that, if it's digestive. So we need to figure out which one it is so that we can hone in on it. And what a lot of people who don't go through this thought process do is they just do all the points, and it does not work as well. And then finally, we've got the kidneys, where we've got our Pac-Man. Stuff comes in, lungs, spleen, Da, Gu come together, and then kidneys, using the Sanjiao, have to send Yuan Qi up to create a little spark right here, which then produces Wei, yeah, and Ying Qi. Right? We got it. That's our basic sequence. If the kidneys are really weak, then this doesn't really happen. And usually the person ends up with Qi stagnation in the chest because all this stuff just gets backed up in here and doesn't have anywhere to go, and they just get stagnant. And so in this case, if we try to do lung 9, no, that doesn't need tonification. Not so much. Kidney 3 and 7, that might work much better. So knowing which of these things is off tells us how to treat it. And if we get all that working correctly, then we're going to have Wei and Ying Qi produced. You guys with me? Yeah, ask questions if you're not. Okay. It's one of the definite downsides of the online education is it's hard for me to tell when you guys understand stuff and when you don't. Like if we're in a classroom, I can tell if people are not following, but it's a little harder here. So I go a bit deeper into, read through the slides on your own time. After this, we spend a bit of time going through how the digestive system works, how air works. We get to how things work well. And then let's just start talking about Wei and Xie. So when we have an external invasion, right, we got the person's skin. Got the person's skin, got the soli, got the muscles. I'll keep writing these, but I've got a feeling that you guys will just know this diagram soon. All right, we got these things. The Wei Qi is hanging out in here, right? This is where it circulates. And out here, we've got all the grumpy Xie Qi. So this Xie Qi is weak. And the person's Wei Qi is strong. The Xie Qi comes in, hits the soli, and the Wei Qi pushes it right back out. You don't notice anything, you don't get sick, nothing happens. What if we've got strong Xie Qi and strong Wei Qi? This is going to come in, get into the soli, and the person will or will not get sick. This will or will not penetrate further, but we're going to get sick here. There's going to be a battle at this point. The person's, all right, remember the classical metaphor for this is a wall around a city with an army on top and a bunch of invaders at the gate. And they're fighting them off. They're trying to get in. If they are of equal power, then we have a battle. And that's what happens here. And this is where you get shivering and you might get cold, you might sweat, you might not sweat, but this is where you kind of go, I've got a cold. Flu, something like that. There's a third condition here, which is if the pathogen's strong, same guy, same pathogen, and the Wei Qi is weak, then this is just going to come right through. Often you won't even get sick on an external level. It'll just start damaging the internal organs, damaging the inside of someone's system. So this is like, in an extreme case, this is someone with poorly regulated HIV who catches a cold and it becomes life-threatening. They often don't even really get a fever. They'll go from like a standard 98.6, they'll just pop up to like 99.5 as their body's slowly shutting down, because it would be the Wei Qi that controls that change, right? It's the fighting of the pathogen that causes the symptoms. The pathogen's happy to just come right through without any problems. If we go back to our archers on the battlements sort of metaphor for this, it's like if there's nobody here and the enemy shows up at the gates, and in fact the gates aren't even like that. The gates are just fully open. They just go through and there's no battle at all. Well, that's what happens if the person's Wei Qi is especially weak and the pathogen invades. So functionally, this means the stronger the Wei Qi, the stronger the response. And the stronger the Xie Qi, the more dangerous it is. So just like within Western medicine, we see most of the symptoms that occur in especially the early stages of getting sick as being the Wei Qi mounting resistance. What we're trying to avoid is this place where the body isn't really fighting and the Xie Qi is deep inside the person causing damage. So I've got a couple of little bar graphs I want to show you. And this is going to be the start of quite a few graphs. They're real simple looking, but there's a lot there. So if the Wei Qi is much stronger than the Xie Qi, if the Wei Qi is much stronger, you might have a little something occur. Remember, this is when the pathogen invades and just comes right back out. There's a huge army on the battlement, on the wall around the city. I mean, in this case, because it's ancient China, we'll just go with this. The horse archers ride up to the wall and they're repelled immediately. You might sneeze, get a sudden shiver, feel like weirdly sick for like a minute and then it passes, but that's about it. This happens frequently. You may have no symptoms at all. This is, from a Chinese medicine perspective, very frequently what random sneezes are. It's like, oh, something tried to get you sick and you just got rid of it. In the event that they're of similar strength, then you can have very strong symptoms. This is when you tend to have the biggest battle occur at that wall, right? If your army and their army are fighting aggressively, it's the biggest battle. This can be over in 20 minutes. This can last a few days. The longer it lingers, the more likely your army is to lose and this thing to invade deeper, because you're constantly getting drained and it may or may not be getting drained. The act of fighting off a disease damages the qi, right? So as your Wei Qi gets used in this conflict, you need to be rebuilding it, which is a lot of the dietary advice that we have for people that are sick, is about building up the Wei and the Yin Qi again so that you can continue to fight off the disease. And the last is if the Xie Qi is stronger than your Wei Qi, then you get sick. So this is if the Xie Qi is a little bit stronger than the Wei Qi, but your Wei Qi is still okay. You're going to get sick, and the pathogen is likely to go to multiple stages if no interventions are done. You know, if they have an acupuncturist who shows up, an herbalist, a medical doctor, this may be something that can be just like gotten rid of immediately, but on its own, it's likely to progress. And the amount of Wei Qi tells you how strong the symptoms will be. If you have very strong Xie Qi and very strong Wei Qi, you're going to have way more extreme symptoms. So I want to highlight this. You guys can all see this PDF, right? So here this is fictional 2 out of 5. There's no 0 to 5 rating scale, but we're going to be using this a bit to just help illustrate these differences, okay? If your Wei Qi is kind of weak and the Xie Qi is medium, then you're going to expect fairly strong symptoms. If the Xie Qi is very strong and the Wei Qi is also quite strong, you're going to have much stronger symptoms, right? Does it make sense to you guys why this is? I'm mostly seeing nodding. Feel free to ask a question in the chat if you'd like to, or just speak up.
Is that because the battle's just bigger?
Yes, that's it. That's it. In this case, you've got a 50-person army fighting a 60-person army. In this case, you've got a 100-person army fighting a 120-person army. There's just more that happens. If you see the damage occurring to the person's system as the damage to the actual wall that you're fighting on, then there's just going to be more damage. So very often this second pattern here, where there's very strong Wei Qi, is the sort of person who says, I never get sick, but when I do, it's very bad. And this person is more likely to be the person who says, I get sick kind of frequently, but it's never particularly bad, right? That's kind of the difference in presentation. The Wei Qi tends to wax and wane over a person's life. So this one here is much more likely to be bedridden, high fever, dramatic symptoms, may progress, may not. Same probability of progression.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Oh, you're about to cover it, I guess. I was just thinking, because you're saying like one of them is where someone gets sick quickly, but not as badly, versus someone doesn't really get sick, but when they do, it's like strong.
Yeah. So in this case,
I just figure, wouldn't the prior person still get sick with bad sicknesses as well, because their Wei Qi is still less than the stronger one?
So I'm going to reiterate here that the Wei Qi dictates how strong the response will be, how strong the appearance of the sickness will be when it's in the exterior like this. The Xie Qi is how dangerous it is, but it's not how big the illness appears. In this case, where the Wei Qi is less than the Xie Qi, but they're both fairly low, if this Xie Qi goes up to 6, which I've kind of got that coming next. If the Xie Qi is much worse, they can't fight harder. They can't get sicker. So even if the Xie Qi gets stronger, their presentation will often not change. It's more dangerous. It's more likely to progress. It's more likely to turn into other things, but the actual illness that they get at first will not be stronger. That makes sense? And in this case, if the Xie Qi is weaker, just nothing will happen. They'll just fight it right off. So they get sick less frequently, but it's more dramatic. They get sick less frequently, it's more dramatic, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better.
And then the person that's the prior one, they won't necessarily get the shivering and the sweating and the headache, because their Wei Qi is not up there to be doing all that.
So this person will probably get all of those things, but they're less likely to be bedridden with it. You tend to lose the sweating and the shivering once the Wei Qi drops a bit lower.
Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean you're getting better.
No, it just means that you're fighting. If the person is especially deficient and the pathogen's very strong, you tend to basically get no symptoms. And that's what we were describing with the HIV, poorly regulated HIV situation, where the person can't fight it. So they're not going to have a big fever with a bunch of shivering and all this stuff. They're just going to be losing that battle. And that actually doesn't look so dramatic a lot of the time. So I reiterate this a few different ways through these slides. So look through them, and like I said, send me questions. We'll keep talking about this stuff. But the Wei Qi is your border guard, And the Xieqi is the invading army. And when we, how far do I go into this? Yeah, okay. We'll go just a little bit further.
I have one more question. I'm sorry. Can I ask it now?
Sure, I've got to draw for a second anyways.
So I was just curious because of what you were explaining, because I always under the impression that, say you did have those shivers and were fatigued and were in bed with really high fever or whatever, I always thought that after a few days, once those things started lessening or getting better, then that meant the person was getting better. But now you're saying that doesn't necessarily mean that. So how do you know if someone
Correct.
actually is getting better? Or
We
just...
are about to do that.
Ah, okay.
We're going to start touching on it now, but you're going to spend quite a bit of time on this over the next couple semesters. So broadly, we're just going to pretend that this is all there is for now. There's Xieqi that's a wind cold, and there's Xieqi that's a wind heat. We got our skin, Soli muscles here, and we've got our Wei Qi. Let's call our Wei Qi normal. The wind cold strong, the wind heat strong. If the wind cold invades and it's fighting your Wei Qi here, but it's likely to win. So this person has gotten sick, right? I have a cold. In fact, we call wind colds colds most of the time. Like, that's kind of funny to me. And if we have a wind heat that penetrates here, exactly the same. This is often more of a I have the flu situation, but there's a lot of overlap between these two things. Both of these are going to filter into different diagnostic systems. So once you have a cold, I can't really come from below with that. Once you have a cold, you're going to be talking about the 6 stages. And once you have the flu, is that on the screen? Not really. Once you have the flu, you're going to be talking about the 4 levels. Okay, all of this is in your slides. Don't worry too much about it. We're just going to do a minute on the basic presentation of each of these today, and we're going to go a little deeper into it in some later classes. For now, this is our basic model. Let's start with the 6 stages. So 6 stages, which means the patient has a wind cold. If we're talking about the 6 stages, we're going to group this, we're going to talk about this in words that you're probably familiar with. Tai Yang. Who can tell me the organs for Tai Yang? Feel free to just shout them out.
Small intestine.
So that's small intestine. Anyone got the second one?
Heart?
Urinary bladder.
Oh.
Then we've got Yang Ming. Organs.
Stomach, large intestine.
Stomach, large intestine. Xiaoyang. Only 2 more yang organs. What do you guys got?
Sanjiao gallbladder.
Gallbladder, Sanjiao. And then we've got Taiyin, which is going to be what?
Lung, spleen.
Lung, spleen. Xiaoyin.
Kidney and heart.
And Jueyin.
Liver and PC.
There we go. Okay. Okay, exterior and interior. This is the progression. So up here we've got just common parlance, common cold, stomach flu, weird flu or lingering flu, lingering cold. And then we've got fatigue, severe fatigue, and then vomiting roundworms. We'll talk about why that one's so weird and different. It says roundworms. I ran out of space. I didn't plan well. Okay, so this is the progression. Patient gets a common cold. If this is not treated properly, they're going to get a stomach flu, lingering cold, fatigue, severe fatigue, vomiting roundworms, and then after that they die. That's our progression of disease in Chinese medicine. What we want to do as acupuncturists is reverse the disease and get it out of the person as quick as possible. We're going to be doing that. So here's that map written down here again. Though I've given it a different name. So the exterior ones look like a sick patient, but not that big of a deal. And the interior ones look like a patient with a serious problem, though it's often not something that we would necessarily call a sickness. So quite a bit of things like chronic fatigue syndrome sit down here in the interior. This is one of the reasons why we talk about wind cold and wind heat. Like, yeah, they're kind of bacteria and viruses sometimes, but we often end up with diseases where we don't have to have any bacteria or virus we can find to see how we got there from a wind cold invasion. We got some, like a deeper description of each of these here. And again, this is a first pass over this. At the Taiyang level, we're going to see a common cold presentation, headaches, chills, floating pulse, no sweating. The Yang Ming, we're going to see more of a stomach flu. We're going to see the four bigs: big sweat, big thirst, big fever, and big pulse. If you ever hear the phrase four bigs, we're talking about a Yang Ming condition. Xiaoyang is a little bit stranger. We see an alternating symptoms. If anyone here has heard of the concept of diseases trapped in latency, we're usually talking about Xiaoyang conditions. And then once we're in the interior, could I do a little more info here before we get into that? So in the exterior, okay, in the 6 stages, the pathogen is interacting with the organs related to where we are. So at Taiyang, with the channels. At Taiyang, we're going to be interacting with the small intestine and UB channels, which is one of the reasons why we have neck tightness as a chief symptom. Both of these, back of neck. The cold gets trapped in the channels, you get this. At the Taiyang, you're going to see the stomach and the large intestine. The Yang Ming is most full of qi and blood. You get the largest and most dramatic symptoms there: big fever, big pulse, big thirst. At the gallbladder and Sanjiao, you've got this place called the pivot that it's hanging out in. Don't worry too much about these details. What I want to say here is that in all of the exterior, which means all of the yang organs, what you're seeing is still pathogen fighting qi. The symptoms you're seeing are the pathogen fighting the person's qi. Once you get to the interior, the pathogen is, the translation we use usually is plundering the person's reserves. So in the interior, you're seeing symptoms of pathogen stealing resources. So there's no battle anymore at this level. All you're seeing is the lack of things. This is why fatigue and coldness begin showing up here. The person's resources are being removed. And it fits that we see that begin with the lung and the spleen. If these two organs are compromised, then you're not going to produce postnatal chi anymore. You guys with me, or have I gone too far afield here? Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up, so I'm going to take this as a good sign. That's most of the description, most of the first pass of this description that I want to cover right now. And we're running a little low on time. Yeah, let's see here. I don't know what to tell you guys about quizzes and things like that coming up. I'd like you to look over the rest of the, oh, we only have a couple slides left. Okay, let me finish this. So that's your very, very rapid introduction to the 6 stages. Things go through these different organ systems. You get these sorts of conditions showing up. I don't want you guys to rote memorize anything really. So we're going to go through exactly why all of this looks this way towards the end of the semester. But for now, I need you to know what the 6 stages are and the order that they're in. This slide right here, I need you guys to know all of this, because this is going to be the language that we're going to use to talk about disease going forward. I don't know if we have a quiz next week or not yet. I haven't figured that out. But if we do, it's going to be on this. And you need to know this. You need to know this for boards. You need to know this for comps. You need to know this for practice. When you're dealing with disease, you need to know this. If you want to deal with chronic fatigue syndrome, if you want to deal with internal medicine stuff, you need to know this too, even if you don't want to do infectious disease. This is something like 2,200 years old. Zhongdong is way back in the day. And it's still used today. This is where we get a lot of our most commonly used herbal formulas. The 4 levels is a much more recent innovation. This is more like 600 years ago. It's like yesterday in Chinese medicine. With the wind cold, now I know how to talk to Dr. Jason. Yeah, it's helpful. He likes this stuff. He's probably going to say something along the lines of, well, that's not completely accurate, but if we look at it from another perspective, and I say this because I love the guy. He's great. It's not me. You all know him. Okay, if we look at the 4 levels, so 6 stages, we're talking about how a wind cold progresses, and it goes through Tai, Yang, Yang, Ming, Shao, Yang. I hope I'm showing off how helpful this shorthand is. Tai Yin, Shao Yin, Jue Yin. Exterior, interior, right? That's the story, that's the progression. On the other hand, we've got the 4 levels, which are telling us how a wind heat progresses. And a wind heat doesn't go through all this fancy channel stuff. The wind heat goes fast and directly. So it just goes through the 4 different levels. Starts off with the Wei Qi, the Wei, then it goes to the Qi, then it goes to the Ying, and then it goes to the Shui. This is the answer on any exam, quiz, board exam, anything like that. In practice, it's really much closer to this. Because once you're down at Yin and Shui, these two interact quite a bit, and you're kind of in both, and it overlaps. You see this manifesting in the points and the herbs, where the formula here and the formula here both have herbs for the other one in it. It's because it's kind of in both once you're at this stage. Once you're at this level, not stage, level. And that's our entire map of how heat diseases work. So this one, at the Wei, is going to look a lot like the common cold, except the person will be sweating and probably have a higher fever. At the Qi level, it looks a lot like the stomach flu. In fact, these two, Yang Ming and Qi, have almost the exact same set of symptoms. Here at Yin, it looks like neurological damage and damage to the person's brain, twitching, a little bit of twitching, but seizures, meningitis, a lot of that's right in here. And here at Shui, we have bleeding issues, bleeding disorders. This one looks like heat in the blood. Anyone remember what acupuncture point I mentioned earlier in this class that's useful for heat in the blood? Shout it out.
PC4.
Good. PC4 is a great point here. That's off the screen. PC4 is a great point here. We in fact might do a bit of bleeding with patients at this stage. On the extreme end, this is something like Ebola, just weird blood movement due to heat. I want you to know these 6 in order. I want you to know which ones are exterior, which ones are interior, and I want you to know these 4 in order. That's pretty much all I want you to know about these things. I want you to know that these are wind heat, these are wind cold. I want you to know these names. I don't expect you to completely understand this yet. This is just going to be the language we begin using to talk about infectious disease. That sound good? And that gets us to the end of those slides. That wasn't too bad, right? It's a weird time to be doing this lecture, but that felt like it went pretty well. You guys doing okay? Good, cool, great. Okay, well, we're not starting anything else. I think that's it for today. I'm glad that this seemed to be something that you guys appreciated. I don't want this class to be a burden, though it is school and semi-mandatory in that sort of way.
I have a
I think,
question.
sure. Let me, I'm going to kind of end the class here and then I'll hang out and take questions for a little bit. I'm going to send you guys some reading to do for next week. We've got a difficult concept to talk about next week, which is how imbalances happen in a person's system without a disease present and how it manifests. This next lecture is harder. So I'm going to put up the slides and put up a reading immediately after this class on the Slack. And I'm also going to put it up on the Moodle. And I just want you guys to go over it once before we talk about it next week, because it's one of those things that the general reaction that students have is, oh, I get this. And then after a day or two of thinking, it turns into, wait, what is this? Any study guides? No, just going to give you a reading to do on it. I guess that's a study guide. Yeah, there will be we're going to do a ton of study guide stuff for the midterm and final. So for those, yes. Yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah, just understand we're going to be having a relatively heady conversation next week. And then we're basically done with the abstract theory and we're actually going to go around and we're going to start slowly going one by one through all the organs and going to a deeper level with them. And the class gets a little more grounded from there on out. Sound good? Okay, thank you guys. I'm going to hang out for like 10 minutes here, answer any questions, but class is officially over. You're welcome to take off. Take care of yourselves. Reach out to people in your life. Lots of people are feeling lonely. Do whatever you can. Stay safe. I don't know if there's a quiz or not next week. I will answer that in the next few hours in an email to everyone. If you don't hear anything from me, there's probably not a quiz, but you need to know this material. There will be a midterm. I will give you a full guide for it. We'll spend time going over it. Yeah, I don't want you guys to be unprepared, but it's also kind of crazy right now. So trying to balance those things. Okay. Thanks, guys. See you next week.